Why did Germany and Austria actually go to war in 1914? The response that every schoolboy can give, of course, is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in June and Austria's subsequent ultimatum to Serbia, whom they accused of having sponsored the butchery. But as you all know, this is not a satisfactory explanation. Both Berlin and Vienna understood a war against Serbia would almost certainly bring in the Russians, and thus triggered the great European cataclysm that both of these powers dreaded as much as everyone else. Both empires' military strategists were famously pessimistic about their chances in such a war, so why start one they had a good chance of losing? I want to propose that one solution is to look at the grand strategic chessboard in 1914, where the Germans and Austrians thought it would go in the near future and why this finally made them willing to risk a European conflict. Europe since 1894 had been divided into two competing alliance systems, France and Russia on one hand, Germany, Austria and Italy on the other. Britain had held aloof before tentatively joining the Paris-Petersburg bloc in 1904. Theoretically, this formed a rough balance of power on the continent, but for much of the period the geopolitical realities were very different. From 1905 the Triple Alliance was in the ascendant. Russian power had been severely weakened by its defeat at the hands of Japan that year and the internal revolutions that followed. France's sudden isolation meant Britain, fearful of unchecked German power, drew closer to Paris so as to prop them up in the equation. When Berlin tested the waters at first, Morocco, London's firm support for France, combined with the French Army 75's, meant they recoiled from provoking a war over colonial squabbles. Instead, the Triple Alliance used Russian weakness to score diplomatic victories, the most bombastic of which was Austria's annexation of Bosnia in 1908, a province it already occupied but was claimed by Serbia, a de facto Russian client. Feeling cheated out of what was initially proposed as a quid pro quo for access to the Straits, Petersburg squealed, and it took a German threat of war to force their climb down. As stated, what's interesting is that gains such as this, if we can call changing the legal status of an obscure Balkan province at the cost of infuriating Russia and getting bailed out by Germany again, is that they were diplomatic rather than military victories. Despite Russia's weakness, Germany in particular hesitated over ever pushing matters to the point of war. It did, of course, threaten it against Russia in 1909, but, despite the favorable military circumstances, remained reluctant to actually force a conflict. Indeed, they did more than hesitate. In 1912, as Serbia expanded in the Balkan Wars, a fearful Austria, watching its influence in the region erode, seriously floated proposals for allying with Bulgaria to crush Belgrade, though there was still a Dove party in Vienna at this point, led by Franz Ferdinand. That Europe did not stumble into war in 1912 or 13 was largely because of Germany refusing to countenance an Austrian war that could bring in the Russians. They did not abandon their ally completely, supporting what they thought were fair Austrian goals, such as blocking the Serbs from getting a base on the Adriatic, but Germany refused to let Vienna actually start the war it wanted. Why then did this position change? Why, in 1914, did Germany allow Austria to have its war, knowing there was a serious possibility of Russian intervention? Firstly, I think it's helpful to consider Austria's strategic situation. The Habsburg problem was that their place in the European system was collapsing. The empire was infamously a multi-ethnic one, with Germans and Magyars ruling over minorities including Italians, Slavs, and Romanians. Unfortunately for Vienna, these three ethnic groups all had national homelands directly bordering them. Now, at the turn of the century, this did not seem like a major problem. In 1905, for example, Serbia had been weak, Italy remained a relatively firm part of the Triple Alliance, and the Home King of Romania was personally committed to the Austro-German bloc. By 1914, the situation was very different. Serbia had doubled in size and was planning to expand its army. The country was clearly moving towards the Anton camp. Even Romania was now tied to Austria only by the aged king, Carol. The crown prince was married to an Anglo-Russian princess and much friendlier to the opponent, Hungarian. Attempts to Magyarize their Romanian minority had also deeply alienated public opinion in Bucharest. When King Carol died, the country would inevitably swing into the Russian sphere. It's when one begins to look at this burgeoning catastrophe on a map that you can understand Habsburg pessimism. They very nearly lost as it was in 1914, against a Serbia still recovering from the Balkan Wars, a neutral Italy in Romania, and a Russia that had not yet completed the Great Program. I want to deal with Russia later, but let's just look at what Austria would have been facing elsewhere. Serbia's expansion meant the Austrians might have actually needed the army group Potor briefly siphoned off in 1914 against them. The possibility of a hostile Romania also serves as a double blow, even if they did not formally join the Entente. Literally, just the possibility of them doing so is a devastating change. In 1914, Austria deployed absolutely squat to the border and relied on Carol's word. Russia, by contrast, deployed 6, admittedly rather weak from what I can find, divisions after Carol's death. This situation would have reversed and the Austrians would have had to cough up basically a new army, while St. Petersburg could have withdrawn theirs. In 1914, Conrad estimated that if the Romanians joined with Serbia, Montenegro, and Russia, the Central Powers would face 128 divisions against their 62. Finally, as the Anton grew in strength, there's every chance Italy would have hitched itself more firmly to this wagon. The high-handedness of Austria and Germany's relations with Rome was a particularly bizarre feature of the pre-war world. Although the Germans despised the Italian army, it was supposed to play a crucial role in the Schlieffen Plan, sending 3 corps to the German left wing and attacking across their own border. Indeed, had they actually joined in 1914 and pinned the French army of the Alps as expected, the Germans would have won. Instead, because apparently pretending to like Italians was too much trouble even for the sake of European domination, Rome sat back when war came and Joffre was able to move his Alpine divisions to the M. Now Austria-Hungary was absolutely not a basket case in 1914. Its economy was strong and the monarchy was very stable. But there was simply no approach the empire could realistically take to counter all of these burgeoning threats. The military was always underfunded, anyway, because of bickering between the Austrian and Hungarian governments, and there was no sign of it changing soon. In reality, the only solution was that which Franz Ferdinand seemed to be fumbling his way towards, namely the Habsburgs were going to have to swallow their pride and cut a deal with the Russians over the Balkans that would have heavily favored Petersburg. This was of course anathema to the likes of Berchtold and Conrad. So what I hope I'm showing here is a picture of why Vienna felt so desperate in 1914. When someone is backed into a corner, they are very likely to fight. Franz Ferdinand's assassination gave Austria casus belli and allowed them to gain the German approval they always knew they needed for a war to destroy Serbia. In truth, there was nothing particularly unique about resorting to military action to subdue a strategic threat. The British had done so against the BS, the Italians against the Turks, the French to an extent in Morocco, and the Russians had attempted it with Japan. The difference with Serbia was, of course, that it would likely trigger the Great European War, and so, for all its bluster, the Germans always stopped short of agreeing to such a campaign. Why then, having rejected Austrian plans in 1912 and 13, did the Germans approve in 1914? Again, I think the strategic context can provide some insight. As stated from 1905, great power interactions revolved around the basic fact of Russian weakness. This does not imply the Germans thought Russia was helpless, but what it does mean is that the Triple Alliance had more freedom of action in international affairs. 1911 saw this change dramatically. The major reforms Russia had implemented after the Japanese War, from land tenure and labor rights to railroad administration, all started to bear fruit, combined with further loans from France and a period of excellent harvests. Russia had an extremely healthy balance of trade with rapidly growing state revenues. This in turn financed what became known as the Great Program, a major expansion of both the army, navy, and rail network. In 1914, the Russians still took 26 days to fully mobilize their armies, compared to 16 for Austria and just 12 for Germany. But from 1917, Russian mobilization times would have been fast enough to allow for an invasion of East Prussia and potentially Silesia within the first weeks of the war. This strategic reality completely cancelled out the Schlieffen Plan. As everybody knows, the scheme called for Berlin to send 7/8 of its army west, turn the French flank and crush them against the German border. Within 6 weeks, he relied entirely on making use of Germany's fast and Russia's slow mobilization times. The Great Program thus completely overturned German strategic assumptions. This really cannot be emphasized enough. All of Germany's hopes are basically undone by Russia's rearmament. You can see how much it unsettled them with the 1913 Army Bill, which raised their peacetime standing army from 136,000 to 890,000 men. To be clear, Germany was an immensely powerful country. It could both afford this increase and increase it yet further if needed. But this did not change the inescapable reality that the assumptions the Schlieffen Plan rested upon would soon be obsolete. And so again, I think one can see how, at least for the militarist faction in Berlin, the walls seem to be closing in around them. Oh, but Germany can just stay on the defensive in the west and divert its main armies east. Well, the Germans thought this was such a bad idea, they suspended planning on it in 1912. Going east throws away Germany's two best hopes of winning this war, namely its mobilization speed and tactical superiority. If the Germans were to reroute east, the Russians would happily bog them down in Poland and draw Berlin into the long war. Almost no one on either side of the fence thought it could win. That is, even if the Western Front holds in this scenario, which the Germans were also not confident about. Now, in reality, we know that everybody underestimated how effective entrenched defensive firepower would be before World War I. We also know that Germany could sustain operations in a long war. But what I'm trying to show is that the Germans themselves did not think this way in 1914. It seemed all the advantages of a long war were with the opponent. This basically, then, is the thesis of this video. Germany and Austria saw their strategic position in Europe collapsing and could not find any realistic way of assuaging their decline. Malta, the chief of the German General Staff, thought 1914 was the last year they could contemplate a war against Russia. That summer seemed to offer the best set of circumstances Germany would have for a while. The widening of the Kiel Canal had just been completed, allowing them to use the high seas fleet, for example, and the Army Bill had come into effect. To be clear, this is not an argument that the war was premeditated, nor does it mean the decision makers in Berlin thought the July crisis had to lead to war. What I am arguing, though, is that the strategic situation shows why figures in Germany, who had previously always served as a stabilizing force in the European system, when it came to the crunch, were suddenly willing to risk a conflict in 1914. We can of course debate whether the situation really was so dire for Germany and Austria. Russian historians like Dominic Levin have argued its booming economy would not have lasted. It came out of a rather specific set of circumstances, and its strong balance of trade, for example, had begun to deteriorate. Likewise, there are arguments that the whole Russian government was on rocky ground by 1914, evidenced by the massacre at Lenin, Goldfields, and increasing strike movement. Russian political and economic history isn't really my area of interest, so I can't make any informed judgment here. Internationally, though, the Anglo-Russian agreement was also shaky as the two clashed over the fate of Persia, and certainly some scholars, like Christopher Clark, have suggested it wouldn't have been renewed in 1915. Personally, although I've made videos sympathetic to this view previously. I've increasingly come to see this as dubious. In the British Foreign Office, the likes of Nicholson and Crowe were still either anti-German or pro-Russian. And in Petersburg, Sazonov was genuinely an Anglophile. The Persian question was basically made up of misunderstandings. But both powers still saw the need to work together in the region. Whatever the case, with the benefit of hindsight, it's possible to argue there were still opportunities for Berlin and Vienna. But, of course, what's important is not our view, but that of the German and Austrian foreign offices, and their views were exceptionally dire. I don't claim this as the solution to the origins of the First World War, not by a long way. The conflict has many fathers, of course, but I do think the international situation can give us an insight into why those fateful decisions were made in 1914.